Hi there, everybody. Jeff Daly here with Our Curious World, bringing you stories of the unexplained, the mysterious, and the just plain weird. Today, we're going to look at the question of whether it's possible to reverse engineer a UFO. This is kind of a big part of the UFO mythology, and so I thought we should take a look at it and see if this is something you can really do or if it's just another story. So here's the basic story, as I understand it, is that there's a belief that UFOs have crashed on Earth and have been recovered. They seem to crash, seems like mostly in the United States, from what I can tell, but apparently they've crashed all around the world. Different governments have recovered them and had scientists secretly studying them. And this has been going on for supposedly decades. And the technologies that they have found in these craft have been supposedly integrated into our own slowly over a period of years. And that's why we have things like microchips and stealth technology and all those kinds of things, because we got it from the UFOs that we captured. So let's look into this and see if this really makes sense. So first of all, what is reverse engineering? Reverse engineering is the process of taking a piece of technology, essentially taking it apart, see how it works, and then either integrating what you've learned into your own technology or to make something exactly the same, make an exact duplicate of it. So I'm going to give you some examples here. First, you see here this little coral encrusted device over my shoulder is called the Antikythera device, and it was found off the Greek island of Antikythera in 1901. And it basically, nobody knew what it was. It was a piece of some gears, looks like some brass gears encrusted in coral. Nobody really knew what it was for. It sort of sat on shelves for the next few decades. In the 1950s, a Yale University professor named Derek de la Sola Price found it and began studying it closely. He began to work out what it really was. It really wasn't until the early 70s, however, they were able to take some photos, x-rays inside of it to see all of the gear mechanisms, how they worked, that they were able to figure out exactly what it was and how it worked. And then they put together a model of it. A team from a team of British researchers in 2008 put together a facsimile from what they learned of it. And what this thing was, first they thought it was what's called an astrolabe. An astrolabe is an instrument used to be used to make astronomical measurements that calculated latitude before they invented the sextant. But actually it was more than that. It was more of a primitive analog computer, because not only was it able to do all the things an astrolabe could do, but it could also predict, calculate future celestial events, not just the current sky like an astrolabe, but actually where the moon and certain planets were going to be months or even years ahead. So it was a very sophisticated piece of machinery that wouldn't see anything like it for another 2,000 years, which is interesting. It was actually thought to have been made sometime in either the 1st or 2nd century BC, likely in Greece. Some people theorize that it was built by Archimedes, the famous Greek scientist, although that's probably not true, although he may have had a role in putting together the math for it, which had made it possible for other people to make it. Remember, this thing is made by hand using just simple files, so it was quite an extraordinary accomplishment. Another example from history, a little bit more recent, is during the First World War, when airplanes first began to participate in combat. It was very difficult to shoot down enemy airplanes because usually you had the machine gunner sitting behind the pilot firing from behind, and it was very difficult to line up on an aircraft and shoot it down that way. So the French developed what's called an interrupter gear, which was designed to, it was attached to the crankcase of the engine, and it was connected to the machine gun, according to the machine gun, so that it would only fire whenever the blades were out of the way of the bullets. This way it allows you to mount a machine gun on the front of the airplane, shooting straight forward, instead of to the side or to the back. Made it much easier to line up on your target and then shoot it down. Here's an example of the French airplane that first used this. This is called a Morane-Saulnier Type L. This came out in 1915 when they integrated this into the aircraft. And it was a big game changer for the French. For a while they were dominating the Germans because they had the ability to fire through the propeller. Unfortunately, one of these airplanes went down intact behind German lines, giving the Germans a chance to look at it, see how it was put together, and they immediately incorporated that into their airplanes, and that basically leveled the playing field again. So that was another example of how reverse engineering really works in a modern setting. To get a little bit more modern, in World War II, right after D-Day, the Germans began firing rockets into London and Antwerp, other cities held by the Allies. These were the V-2 Terror rockets, or Terror missiles. They were actually the first ballistic missiles. They didn't have any guidance system, a very rudimentary guidance system, but they weren't able to be targeted. So they were like really just dumb bombs. But they still did a lot of damage to London and other cities, killed thousands of civilians in the process. But anyway, when the war ended, Germany surrendered in May of 1945, there were still hundreds of these rockets had been produced, and they were just sitting there. And so the Allies, the Americans and the Soviets specifically, took as many of these as they could find back to their countries, along with some of the scientists who worked on them. And then we studied them, and we figured out how they worked as best we could. We fired a bunch of them off, and our early space flights were all really just V-2 rockets. However, we did take the technology that we learned, saw how they were put together, and we incorporated that into our own rocket called the Redstone, which first flew in 1958. So we didn't actually build a replica of the V-2. As you can see here, it's very different looking from the weapon, looking from the V-2. But the Soviets, however, did go ahead and replicate it perfectly. They made it rivet for rivet, called the R-1, which was exactly a V-2 rocket, just made out of Soviet parts. And they began flying that in 1950. So both these rockets were pretty common during the 50s, early 60s, and then they were replaced by much larger, more powerful rockets later on. So that was a good example of how you could use these to use the technology to up your own game, so to speak, bring your own technology up to speed. Another cool example, I think, is this airplane here. This is called the B-29. You probably have seen pictures of it from World War II or in movies. It was the aircraft that bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki with the atomic bombs. In any case, during the war, several of these airplanes were damaged over Japan, and they couldn't get back to base, so they flew on to Vladivostok, Russia, where they were interned by the Soviets, because at the time Russia was not at war with Japan, so the legal rules were you had to intern any combatant airplanes. So they did that. But not only did they take these airplanes into custody, but they also took them apart and replicated them rivet for rivet, exactly the same as the plane was. There's even a story that there was a small aluminum plate that had been riveted over a hole in the bomber from a previous mission, and the Russians, or the Soviets, actually integrated that little plate, that little repair plate, right into their final design. So if you can look at this, this is the Tupolev 4 bomber. This is what they came up with. You notice how much the two bombers look alike. Here's a side-by-side comparison. And the reason they look so much alike is because they are essentially the same exact airplane, just made by two different countries. And the reason the Russians did this was because their own aviation industry was a little bit behind ours, particularly when it came to heavy bombers. This is what they were using. This kind of crude-looking thing is called a Petlyavik PE-8. And they had designed this before World War II even broke out. So by the end of the war, they were still using these, but they were not particularly useful. They were obsolete. That's why Stalin ordered the B-29 to be copied, because he wanted to take a big technological leap ahead. And that's exactly what they did. So they went ahead and replicated this airplane, and they flew them all the way into the 1950s until the jet engines came along and made all of the propeller-driven bombers obsolete. So those were two, or actually 3 or 4 good examples of how reverse engineering works. But the reason it works, in the requirements to make it work, is that you have to have a comparable level of technology. If you don't have the infrastructure, the materials in place, the technological expertise to understand how the machine is working, you're not going to be able to replicate it. Now, the Soviets had, in the case of the B-29 and the V-2, they had all that in place. They had a large industrial complex, military complex, so it was pretty easy for them to replicate it once they understood how it worked. And so that's how they got their airplane. So also, it's not just a matter of having the technical expertise. You have to have access to the same materials. So they had access, obviously, to aluminum. It wasn't as high a grade as the American aluminum, but it still worked for their purposes. So if you have those two things, yeah, you can reverse engineer almost anything. And we have done it all the time, quite a few times. Generally, we've had it happen to us more than we've taken other people's technology, but it happens both ways. So let us think about it for a minute. What would it take to replicate something that's not of a comparable technology to ours, but way, way ahead of ours? So the UFOs that we're talking about are thought to be hundreds, if not thousands, of light years ahead of us. They'd have to be in order to cross the vast expanses of space to come here. So the question is, how would we do if we had a piece of really advanced technology and we tried to see how it works and then replicate it? So let's take an example here. This is a modern nuclear submarine. And what we're going to do is we're going to take this submarine and we're going to go back in time and we're going to give it to the greatest minds of the 19th century to see if they can reverse engineer it. So you're talking, Edison, Bell, Morse, Tesla, even a young Einstein. Let's say all the best scientists and engineers in the entire world. And they all have unlimited access to this machine. They have unlimited funding. Would they understand things like how the nuclear reactor works, or how the electronics work on board? It's all solid state. The computers, the radar, the sonar. Could they figure out any of these things? Remember, none of these things had been invented in the 1890s. So they would not only have to try to figure out how they work, but then they would have to figure out how to make their own similar items. And it would be almost impossible, really, to do it at that time. They just didn't have the industrial capability, even if they understood how it worked, which would be a long shot that they could necessarily figure out the reactor. Maybe they could, but even if you did, you couldn't replicate it, so you're stuck. So, and that's just 125 years in the future. We could actually go even back further. Let's say we take the first nuclear submarine, the USS Nautilus. Here's a picture of it being launched. This was launched in 1955. And if we gave that to the people of the 19th century, that's only 55 years in the future. They still wouldn't be able to replicate it, even though it's a primitive submarine by our standards. It's over half a century obsolete. They still wouldn't be able to do it. That's because the leaps in technology were so great between 1900 and 1955 that it would just be almost impossible for them to replicate these things. So that brings us to the question of UFOs crashing here. Could we somehow figure out how these machines work? So let's think about that for a second. I'm not going to go into whether there are recovered discs or not. I want to do another video on that where I go into that in a lot more detail, whether there actually are crash discs out there. But let's say, for the sake of argument, that one of them at least did crash sometime in the last 50, 70 years, somewhere in the United States. Here's a couple of things to think about. Normally when an airplane crashes, if they go straight in, they just leave a big smoking crater. There'd be really nothing of any value to recover, really. There would just be a big slag heap of metal. Sometimes they break up in midair and you got a large scattered field of pieces all over the place, which again is not very useful if you're trying to reverse engineer. In order to reverse engineer something, you need something that's intact, preferably brand new, working perfectly, or at least it's intact enough that you can figure out how it works. Then there's a couple of questions to consider, though. Let's say that this spaceship did crash for some reason. If it's one of only one kind of spaceship, it would be a problem. But Does it have any kind of a alien recovery protocol? In other words, if one of the alien ships went down, and wouldn't the other ones that came with it, presumably there's more than one, because these are small ships. I don't know how they could go all the way across the galaxy without having a mothership of some kind. You would think that the mothership would note that one of their craft had gone down, and they would have some procedure in place to recover it themselves. So you might have an issue when you are trying to get this thing, and you might encounter the aliens who want it back first. Let's say, though, that the ship somehow isn't recovered. They don't have a protocol, or it was by itself. It really was a solo ship. Does it have a self-destruct mechanism? It's something that you might want to put into a vessel of this nature, specifically so it doesn't fall into the hands of primitives. So let's say that there's no recovery efforts made by the aliens. There's no self-destruct mechanism. Hopefully there's no bodies in it. That's another thing we'll talk about in this other video. So you did recover it, and we took it to some secure place somewhere. So how many people would be involved in that? You'd have to have the military, certainly, for security. You'd have to have the top scientists in the United States and probably around the world, at least in the Western world, come in and look at it. So you're talking scores, maybe hundreds of people would eventually be involved in examining at least parts of this thing. It would be hard to see how you could maintain security on this. Now remember, this is something that supposedly happened 75 years ago. That's decades ago. How would you be able to maintain that security that long? Some people maintain that the government is hiding all this stuff, but they've never yet produced any evidence that these things exist, other than some anecdotal accounts and a couple of supposed eyewitnesses who've seen these things. But that's far from evidence. I think it would be fairly easy, not perhaps easy, but it would be possible to at least take a chunk off one of these vehicles if they existed and try to sneak it out and let people know that these things really are there, but it's never happened. So, but even if we could maintain the security and keep this thing under wraps, would we really understand how it works? And we talked about our submarine earlier, how difficult that would be just to replicate 75-year-old technology. You can imagine how hard it would be to do technology that's hundreds, if not thousands of years ahead of our own. Could we even figure out how it works without, say, hitting the wrong button and blowing it up? Is there any kind of radiation with it? There's all kinds of factors that you'd have to take into account before you decide to replicate it. So if we can't even understand how it operates, it would be extremely dangerous to get inside this thing and try to take it apart. I would think it would be almost foolhardy. But anyway, even if we could figure it out and we understood the technology, do we have the materials that they use to build it? They might have very exotic compounds, metals of different kinds that don't exist here on Earth. We wouldn't have the ability to necessarily fabricate them. We might, even if we understood exactly what they're made of, to be able to actually replicate it would be quite a different story. So there's so many reasons that it would be almost impossible to reverse engineer one of these machines. The thing is, you got to remember, is that we understand where the technologies that we have came from. We have documented the advances as they've come along. Each technology seems to piggyback onto the next one. So as we move down the road towards a more sophisticated technology or machine, we've kept track of it. We know who designed it, who built it. We have the patents we can look at. So the stealth technology and microchips, these things like that, they came from our own inventiveness, our own creativity, and our own hard work. They weren't given to us by aliens or anything like that. So stories of crash disks, reverse engineering, like I said, they're anecdotal stories. They've never been confirmed. There's really hard to imagine that the government could keep this all covered up. I personally don't believe it myself, but you're free to believe however you want. As such, I think it'll be very centuries before we develop the sort of spacefaring technologies that UFOs supposedly contain Until then, we'll just have to get by with what we've got and advance the old-fashioned way, step by precarious step. Hey, by the way, if you want to know more about reverse engineering, a few years ago I wrote a book called UFOs, The Great Debate, which I talk a lot more about this whole idea of reverse engineering and some of the issues with it. If you want the book, it's still available on Amazon, even though it's been out of print for a while. You can still find some used copies. Also, I'll leave the link for it below in the description. So if you like this video, please hit that like and subscription buttons if you feel so led. See more stories about our curious world. And until next time, just remember this: birthdays are good for you. They've done studies and they found that people who have the most of them live the longest. So until next time, this is Jeff signing out. Bye.